They came for it at 10:43 a.m. on a Wednesday. I was sitting on the porch enjoying a quiet cup of coffee, not bothering anyone, when I heard the sound of boots on gravel and the faint whir of a battery-powered angle grinder. I thought maybe it was just more street maintenance. But then I saw her, Karen, HOA president, wearing mirrored sunglasses like she was leading a SWAT raid, flanked by 2 board members and some guy in an orange vest holding bolt cutters way too big for HOA business. That's when I realized they weren't here to talk. They were here to take my ammo locker. My federally licensed, military-registered, bolted-down ammo locker. The one that, if tampered with, sends a real-time alert straight to the Department of Defense. And she was about to touch it. The second I stood up, I knew I'd be wasting my breath with the usual logic. Karen had that smug HOA face, the kind that says rules only apply when she's the one writing them. She raised her little clipboard and called out like she was auditioning for Judge Judy. "Sir, this structure violates Aesthetic Code 3.11b for unauthorized metal containers visible from the sidewalk. You were given notice. We're seizing it under HOA authority." The only thing more ridiculous than her confidence was the fact she genuinely believed she had that authority. I tried reason. I told her it wasn't just any locker. That it was part of my defense contractor clearance. That it was wired into a military oversight grid, and touching it would trigger an automatic alert. Karen smiled like I'd just told her I moonlighted as Batman. I didn't even finish my sentence before her orange vest guy leaned in with the bolt cutters. One clamped down on the bottom lock and the panic alert blinked red. A signal quietly pulsed out into the digital void. Somewhere, a server in Virginia pinged. And somewhere else, 2 black SUVs began their engines. Karen didn't notice. She turned to her board like she'd just won a medal. "See? Nothing happened. These veterans always exaggerate. It's probably just full of fishing tackle." The guy next to her actually laughed. I stood still, not moving a muscle. I wanted to say "I told you so," but I was busy watching the sky. It didn't take long. 15 minutes later, I heard them. 2 government-issued SUVs tore up the neighborhood street like a tornado with headlights. No logos, no plates, just matte black and business. They screeched to a stop right in front of my yard. 4 men stepped out, all in military-grade tactical gear, complete with earpieces and a lieutenant's bark. "Perimeter check. Secure the site. Drone scan now." Karen's clipboard hit the grass. She actually gasped, then tried to introduce herself like this was some kind of meet and greet. "Hi, I'm the HOA president. We were just removing." That was as far as she got before one of the officers raised his hand and said, "Ma'am, step away from the structure. This is a protected asset under federal code. You've committed a breach." Her mouth opened and closed like a trout. One of the officers pulled a tablet and swiped through the alert log. Photos were taken. 1 attempted breach. Transmission of images to unknown cloud server. "That's a violation." Karen started stammering, blaming her maintenance guy. "I didn't upload anything. I didn't even touch it. He did all that." But the officers didn't care. "Ma'am, the footage from the surveillance cameras says otherwise." And just like that, her face drained of all color. Because, of course, I'd installed my own surveillance, layered and looping, to back up everything I knew would eventually go sideways. They didn't cuff her, not yet. But they did escort her and her bolt cutter buddy to the sidewalk and radioed in their ID for background check. The guy in charge turned to me with the first sign of a smile. "You did the right thing not confronting them directly. This is exactly why this system exists." I nodded and asked the one question I already knew the answer to. "So, what happens now?" He looked toward Karen, who was trying to pretend she didn't know how to sweat. "Now we investigate who gave her clearance to act like this. And if she doesn't have it, this won't be handled by local police. It'll be escalated." By noon, the SUVs had vanished. The officers were gone. And Karen? Karen was still standing there, staring at the locker like it had just personally ruined her entire year. She tried to rally one last time, shouting something about a neighborhood vote and dangerous items stored near children. I waved her off and went back inside. But I didn't go far. I knew she wasn't done. People like her never are. They think a clipboard makes them invincible, that a title like President gives them the right to rewrite the laws of common sense. But she was about to learn something the hard way. My locker didn't hold weapons. It held files, code, and documentation from my time working with the Department of Defense on experimental ballistic storage. And now, her digital fingerprints were all over it. That evening, I reviewed the footage again, just for fun. Karen had leaned into the lockbox like a cat burglar in a TV drama. She smiled, posed, and even took a few selfies. One of those selfies was geotagged. And because her phone was logged into the HOA cloud, every photo synced instantly. Unbeknownst to her, she'd essentially sent classified object schematics to an unsecured civilian server. That's what tripped the second wave of alerts. Not just local, but federal. I made a quiet note to double my outdoor camera storage and rotate the passcodes. The next morning, I received a formal letter via encrypted email from a military liaison office. It confirmed that breach protocols had been triggered correctly. It also requested I retain all surveillance evidence for potential use in federal court proceedings. Alongside it was a document confirming the HOA had no authority, zero jurisdiction, to interfere with a federally registered, location-locked armory-grade container on private property. I smiled reading it. It was the kind of smile that only comes when the universe hands you a perfect plate of karma. Later that day, Karen tried to play innocent. She came over with that same clipboard, a pathetic little grin plastered across her face, and said, "Let's just move past this. Maybe relocate the locker behind a fence. You know, for appearances." I looked her straight in the eye and said, "The only thing getting relocated is your HOA badge. Maybe to evidence." She huffed, turned, and stomped off like a child denied candy. But she knew. Deep down, she knew this was just the beginning. Because what she didn't realize, what no one on that board realized, is that trying to seize that locker was like pulling a pin on a grenade you didn't know existed. And it hadn't exploded yet. But it would. The next 48 hours felt like walking through a neighborhood dipped in static. People didn't know whether to wave at me or avoid eye contact completely. A few neighbors tried to act casual, mowing their lawns or checking their mail with one eye still on my driveway, like the ammo locker might suddenly grow legs and march down the street. I wasn't surprised. A blacked-out military convoy showing up in a suburban cul-de-sac isn't something people forget over a weekend. But what did surprise me was how quickly Karen tried to twist the narrative. By Friday morning, flyers started appearing on doorsteps and HOA group chats began lighting up. The headline on her poorly designed leaflet read, "Emergency Safety Meeting, Discussing the Threat in Our Midst." I knew exactly who that threat was supposed to be. Karen was nothing if not theatrical. The emergency HOA meeting was scheduled for that very evening at the community center, and somehow she'd framed it as a necessary intervention to protect the neighborhood from a military-grade hazard. She even used a stock photo of a rusty old grenade as the flyer's background image, as if I was hoarding unstable explosives next to the kids' lemonade stand. I figured it was better to show up than let her control the narrative. When I walked in, the room went dead quiet. Every plastic chair creaked as heads turned toward me. Karen was standing at the front with her usual smug posture, this time flanked by Dennis, the HOA treasurer, who always looked like he'd just swallowed a lemon and didn't want anyone to know. She welcomed everyone in a tone that suggested she'd single-handedly saved them all from annihilation. "Thank you for coming on such short notice. As you all know, a dangerous situation recently unfolded in our community involving the storage of unauthorized military materials on private property." She turned her eyes toward me with a rehearsed gasp, the kind of overacted nonsense you'd expect from someone who once ran a high school drama club. While I can't go into details due to ongoing investigations, I believe it's our responsibility to consider the safety of our children, our property values, and our peace of mind." Someone in the back muttered, "Wasn't it you who brought the bolt cutters?" Karen ignored the comment. Instead, she clicked a remote to advance her PowerPoint presentation, which she clearly thought would make everything more convincing. The next slide showed a blurry screenshot from the previous day's incident, likely pulled from Dennis's phone. It was a photo of one of the black SUVs parked in front of my house. "This," she said, "is what our neighborhood has become. A place where unmarked vehicles show up because of secrets stored next to swing sets." That's when I stood up. I wasn't planning to speak, but the sheer absurdity of her performance demanded a response. "For the record," I said, "those vehicles showed up because someone broke federal protocol by photographing and attempting to dismantle a secured, government-registered locker. They didn't come for me. They came because someone here triggered a federal breach." Karen started to interrupt, but I held up the printout I'd brought, an official letter from the Department of Defense confirming that the storage locker was protected under military oversight due to the contents and purpose. I didn't go into what that purpose was because I didn't need to. The letter did the heavy lifting. Karen tried to recover. "Even if that's true, shouldn't we have a say in whether it's appropriate for our neighborhood?" Dennis leaned into the mic and added, "This isn't a military base. It's Maplewood Estates." I turned to face the room. "Maplewood Estates isn't above federal law. And neither is your HOA. You all have a right to be informed, and you deserve safety. That's why I never made this public. Because it wasn't a risk, until someone else made it one." The room buzzed with murmurs. A few people nodded. Someone even clapped, awkwardly and alone, but still. Karen looked like she'd bitten into an olive pit. But she wasn't done. Later that night, I found out she had already submitted a formal report to Homeland Security using a public portal meant for suspicious activity. She framed it like I was running a rogue weapons depot. She included photos, statements, and even a video where she described the terror-like behavior of my so-called operations. The woman had actually edited it like a mini-documentary. If it weren't so serious, it might have been funny. But by the next morning, my phone buzzed with a restricted call. It was Homeland Security. They wanted to send someone by to verify the report. When the agents arrived, they were nothing like the ones from earlier. These guys were in suits, polite but tense, the kind of people who carried 10 credentials and used none. They asked to speak in private, and I led them to the garage where the locker stood, untouched since the day Karen tried to open it. I gave them the full background, pulled up the footage from my home security system, and showed them the email trail from my previous military contracts. They didn't ask about weapons, probably because they already knew everything. What they wanted to know was how Karen had gotten access to the content. I explained that she had photographed the locker, and because her phone was synced to the HOA's cloud server, it triggered a scan on the server's metadata, which flagged a match with a government file index. One of the agents leaned forward. "So her phone uploaded the photos to a shared platform accessible to others?" I nodded. "That's what triggered the breach escalation." They exchanged a look. Then one of them pulled out a tablet and started taking note. "We'll need to follow up with the HOA board and potentially obtain access to that cloud account. If classified storage was exposed via open upload, it's not just a policy issue, it's a security violation." I didn't need to ask what that meant for Karen. The way they were already drafting notes and citing statutes told me everything I needed to know. When they left, they thanked me for my cooperation. One of them said, "We usually don't get reports like this from suburban communities. But then again, most people don't try to seize federally secured hardware for landscaping reasons." I laughed, but it wasn't funny. Not really. Because I knew Karen would double down, not back off. Sure enough, that evening, her friend Dennis posted a long rant in the HOA forum accusing me of weaponizing the government against private citizens. He called me a military snitch and claimed that the real danger wasn't my locker, but the fact I had connections in high places. The post was shared over 50 times, and one neighbor even started a petition for my removal from the neighborhood on grounds of endangering the peace. That was the moment I realized this wasn't just about a locker anymore. It was war. So I did what any reasonable person with a federal background and a growing digital footprint would do. I printed out every HOA complaint, every screenshot, every share, every manipulated video clip. I organized them in a binder labeled Defense. Not because I was afraid, but because Karen had pushed this past reason. She'd weaponized paranoia, and it was time to prepare for whatever foolish move she planned next. Because when you mess with someone who's spent years securing federal property, you better pray you're not the one who leaves fingerprints. The storm didn't hit with thunder or lightning. It came in the form of a 5 a.m. rumble from the street. I'd barely gotten out of bed when I heard the crunch of tires over gravel and the low growl of a diesel engine idling just outside my property line. At first, I thought it was a delivery truck or maybe utility work starting early. But the moment I looked out the window, my stomach dropped. There, right at the edge of my driveway, sat a flatbed truck loaded with what looked like demolition tools, flanked by a small bulldozer. Karen was standing nearby in her robe and sandals, arms crossed, a flashlight gripped in her hand like it was a baton of justice. She had brought her cousin, an unlicensed contractor I recognized from an earlier HOA beautification project that somehow turned the community garden into a mud pit. He was already unloading the bulldozer and gesturing toward my ammo locker. It took less than 30 seconds for me to realize they weren't here to bluff. They were going to try to tear it out. Not through a vote, not through paperwork, just raw force. Karen was on her phone, whispering to someone as if she were conducting a military op of her own. I could make out phrases like "before sunrise," "no security cameras active yet," and "he can't stop us if it's already removed." She must have figured early morning would give her a head start before anyone could react, including me. What she didn't know, what she never seemed to understand, was that the locker was wired for motion alerts. The second her cousin stepped foot near it with equipment, an automated ping was sent directly to both the military liaison and local law enforcement, not to mention my personal notifications. I was already moving before she finished her call. By the time I reached my yard, Karen had her cousin revving the bulldozer's engine. I stood at the edge of the lawn and yelled over the noise, asking if she'd finally lost her mind. She gave me that same saccharine smile she always used when she knew she was caught but didn't care. "This is HOA land now," she called out. "The board voted this structure as abandoned hazardous equipment. We're removing it for safety." I couldn't believe how far she was willing to push the lie. Even if you ignored the legal documents, the federal seals, and the cease and desist letter, there was no scenario where private citizens could lawfully use heavy machinery to rip out government property. But Karen didn't live in reality. She lived in her own self-righteous fantasy, where clipboards granted power and bulldozers solved legal dispute. As her cousin started rolling the machine toward the locker, a voice cut through the dawn air. "Stop the vehicle immediately and move away from the structure." It came from behind me. I turned to see two uniformed officers stepping out of a patrol car that had pulled up silently just seconds earlier. One held a flashlight, the other already had his hand resting on the grip of his holstered weapon. Karen froze. Her cousin killed the engine. One of the officers walked straight over to the locker and began inspecting it. He didn't need long to verify it. A minute later, another vehicle pulled up, this one not local. It was base security from the nearby military installation. The lead officer stepped out with a clipboard of his own and immediately requested the names of everyone present. Karen started blustering, trying to throw her cousin under the bus, saying she wasn't involved, she was just supervising for safety, and didn't realize there would be a problem. Her cousin wasn't nearly as smooth. He looked like a deer in headlights and asked if federal offense meant jail time. The military officer didn't smile. He didn't scold them like a parent catching teenagers. He informed them, calmly and clearly, that attempting to remove or damage a federally monitored security container constituted tampering with protected infrastructure under Title 50 of the United States Code. He explained that not only had they activated a motion alert, but Karen's HOA emails, previously turned over by another board member, were now being reviewed by federal investigators for intent. Her presence on site, combined with evidence of planning, constituted premeditation. It was no longer a neighborhood dispute. It was a legal operation. Karen's mouth moved but nothing came out. Her cousin tried to sneak back to the truck. The officers stopped him. As all of this unfolded, neighbors began filtering outside. First in ones and twos, then by the dozen. People came out in robes and slippers, coffee mugs in hand, watching as their HOA president was questioned by both police and military officials in the middle of the street. Some recorded. Some whispered. Everyone knew they were witnessing something far beyond petty rule enforcement. Karen wasn't just losing control. She was unraveling in real time. As officers continued gathering information, one of them found a box of tools in the back of the contractor's truck labeled with a fake company name, yet another violation. The entire vehicle was impounded. Karen's cousin was detained on-site for trespassing and attempted destruction of protected property. And Karen? She was asked to remain on her front porch until further notice, pending questioning. That afternoon, the community center was placed under temporary federal lockdown. Officers arrived to collect digital records from HOA computers, including login histories and internal communications. A forensic cyber unit was brought in to determine whether any sensitive material had been accessed or distributed. I wasn't surprised when I heard what they found. Karen had been logging into the HOA database from her home laptop and had attempted to access my property registry multiple times. Even worse, she had used the board's administrative access to search public safety databases under the guise of resident safety checks. It was illegal. All of it. When the board held an emergency meeting that evening, it wasn't to make decisions. It was to resign. One by one, members stepped down, citing Karen's deception, misuse of power, and disregard for federal warnings. The only person who didn't resign was Karen herself, because she wasn't given the chance. She was removed. Officially, unanimously, and permanently. As she stood to protest, claiming none of this was her fault, one of the remaining board members quietly handed her a printed page. It was a list of federal statutes she had violated, with timestamps and document attachments. She went pale. Her last words before storming out of the room were, "I was just trying to protect the neighborhood." By the time Monday rolled around, it was obvious Karen had no intention of backing down. The weekend's tension hadn't cooled anything off, it had only given her time to double down on her efforts. She walked around the neighborhood as if nothing had happened, clipboard in hand, fake smile plastered across her face like she was running for office. But under that smile was something sharper, something more determined. She wasn't just angry, she was obsessed. And unfortunately for everyone in the neighborhood, obsessed people with a little bit of power are the most dangerous kind. Early that morning, I received a letter taped to my front door. It wasn't from the HOA directly, but from a third-party compliance agency hired by the HOA board, clearly Karen's doing. The letter cited multiple violations: improper storage of hazardous materials, obstruction of public aesthetics, and uncooperative behavior during community safety reviews. It was both laughable and disturbing. The agency didn't exist online outside of a generic P.O. box and a Gmail address, which was already enough to raise red flags. I made some calls. After 20 minutes, a contact in Federal Property Oversight confirmed what I suspected. The so-called compliance agency wasn't licensed or authorized. It was just a name Karen had slapped on a fake letterhead to make her actions seem official. That same day, I caught 2 HOA members walking around the perimeter of my property with measuring tape and a drone. They claimed they were verifying distances for potential easement updates, but we both knew they were just snooping. One of them had the nerve to point at the locker and say, "You should just get rid of it. We can't have military stuff here. People are talking." I asked him if people were also talking about the military convoy that showed up because Karen broke federal law. He didn't answer. Just looked down at his shoes and mumbled something about keeping the peace. I reminded him that peace doesn't come from pretending rules don't apply. It comes from respecting them. Later that afternoon, I received a knock on the door. This time, it wasn't Karen or one of her clipboard cronies. It was a military officer in dress uniform accompanied by a legal liaison. They introduced themselves as representatives of the Judge Advocate General's Corps, JAG, the legal branch of the military. Apparently, the Department of Defense had escalated the situation after discovering Karen's photo uploads had triggered a classified information scan. The liaison handed me a formal cease and desist order addressed to the Maplewood Estates Homeowners Association. It stated in no uncertain terms that any further interference with federally registered equipment, documentation, or personnel would be considered obstruction under multiple federal statutes. It also included an attached summary of legal action that would be pursued if the HOA failed to comply. One look at the documents told me Karen had officially gone from nuisance to national security liability. I asked the officer what the next steps would be. He told me an internal team would begin reviewing the HOA board's activities for potential violations, and depending on what they found, the entire board could face criminal charges, not just Karen. That included Dennis, the treasurer, and a couple of others who had rubber-stamped her complaints without asking questions. When I told him that Karen had sent around a fake compliance letter using a shadow agency, he just raised an eyebrow and said, "That's fraud. Add it to the list." As they left, I watched the officer quietly take a few photos of the area and mark down GPS coordinate. He wasn't just here for conversation. He was building a case. Word of the JAG visit spread quickly. By nightfall, the HOA group chat was in chaos. People were arguing back and forth, some defending Karen, others demanding her resignation. Screenshots leaked of Karen privately messaging members of the board, urging them to stand their ground and promising that they can't arrest all of us. It was a mixture of arrogance and panic, the words of someone who knew the walls were closing in. One member posted a message begging for a special meeting to reconsider leadership direction, which was HOA speak for, "We need to get rid of Karen before this goes nuclear." But even with all this, Karen wasn't done. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of metal clanking outside. When I looked through my window, I saw a pickup truck with a trailer backing into the edge of my lawn. Two men jumped out with gloves and work belts, and before I could even process what was happening, they started unloading equipment, a small hydraulic jack, some straps, and a mechanical winch. They were trying to move the locker. I bolted out the front door and shouted before they could get started, "You touch that locker, and the military won't be the only ones coming. That's felony theft of secured federal property." The men looked confused. One of them stammered, "We were just hired for a pickup job." HOA said this was abandoned equipment. I pointed at the large sign affixed to the locker. "Federal asset, unauthorized access prohibited under Title 50. You missed the part where it says felony." They got back in the truck and drove off without another word. I called the officer I'd spoken to the day before and gave him the update. He told me to document everything and prepare a copy of the incident for the federal investigators who were now officially reviewing the HOA's activities. I sent over the footage from my door cam, including a clear shot of the truck's plate. I didn't know who the hired hands were, but I had a good idea who made the call. Karen had now escalated from trespassing to attempted property seizure. That evening, I received an unexpected visitor. One of the HOA board members, a guy named Lucas who had always stayed quiet during meetings, came to my door with a pale face and a folder in hand. He looked like someone who had just realized they'd bet on the wrong horse. "I didn't sign up for this," he said. Karen told us you were storing explosives. She said if we didn't act, we'd all be liable. He handed me the folder. Inside were printed copies of internal emails between Karen and the board. In them, she discussed strategies to pressure the homeowner into compliance, and even floated the idea of fining me into bankruptcy. She made jokes about teaching him a lesson, and referred to the locker as his toy war box. It was damning. More than that, it was cruel. Lucas apologized and left quickly. I scanned and forwarded the documents to the JAG office before burning a copy to a secure drive. The writing was on the wall. Karen wasn't just in over her head, she was dragging the entire board down with her. She thought her title made her untouchable, but she'd mistaken a seat at the table for a throne. And now, with the feds involved and her own board turning on her, that throne was crumbling beneath her feet. I went out to my porch, looked over at the locker still standing firm and untouched, and took a deep breath. It was more than just steel and bolts now. It had become a symbol of every line Karen had crossed, every lie she'd told, and every neighbor she'd dragged into her personal vendetta. But it wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a very public reckoning. Because when you try to turn federal protocol into a neighborhood squabble, you don't just lose your power, you lose the game. But no one followed her. No one clapped. No one defended her. The very people she claimed to represent now stared at her like she was radioactive. And maybe she was. Her obsession with control, her inability to accept limits, and her delusional belief in her own authority had brought her entire empire crashing down. All for what? To remove a locker she never had the right to touch in the first place. That night, I walked out to the edge of my yard and looked at the locker. Still standing. Still secured. Still connected to the same alert system that had protected it from day one. I thought about installing a second one just to make a point. Not because I needed it, but because I could. Across the street, porch lights turned off one by one as the neighborhood finally settled back into something like peace. It had taken bulldozers, board resignations, and federal intervention, but it was quiet now. And maybe, just maybe, the people who had stayed silent until now had finally learned what happens when you let one person turn rules into weapons. Karen didn't just lose her position. She lost her illusion of power. And the neighborhood would never look at her, or the HOA, the same way again. In the days that followed, the neighborhood transformed in a way no one could have predicted. For the first time in months, there were no citations slipped under windshield wipers, no random drone flyovers, no one pacing the sidewalks with a camera and clipboard pretending to be a law enforcement officer. It was almost eerie how quiet things got, but it was the kind of silence that follows a storm, fragile, cautious, and laced with the unspoken realization that everything had changed. Karen's removal from the HOA board wasn't just a shift in leadership. It was a collapse of a regime that had ruled through fear, pettiness, and paperwork warfare. The once iron-fisted neighborhood was now trying to figure out what life looked like without that constant threat looming over them. But for Karen, life had taken a far sharper turn. News had traveled fast, especially once federal agents began conducting interviews. Karen's cousin, who had been caught operating the bulldozer, was still being held for questioning regarding multiple illegal contracts in the area. As for Karen, she was issued a federal summons within a week. It turned out that her actions didn't just fall under HOA misconduct. They met the legal threshold for obstruction, illegal surveillance, attempted destruction of federal property, and unauthorized access to secure infrastructure databases. Homeland Security got involved again, not because they had to, but because once her name entered the system connected to a prior cybersecurity breach from a neighboring community, everything got reevaluated. The irony was thick. Karen, who had spent her HOA career enforcing pointless aesthetic rules and shaming residents for hanging holiday lights a day too early, was now on the hook for real federal crimes. Her reputation collapsed long before her trial even began. Parents pulled their kids from her neighborhood Facebook group. Other board members scrambled to erase their digital footprints from anything tied to her name. Even Dennis, who had been her most loyal follower, issued a public apology in the next HOA newsletter, distancing himself from her entirely. But the damage had already been done. Meanwhile, I was asked to attend a private meeting with a group of government officials. Not in a courtroom, not in an office. At a secure facility about 45 minutes outside the city. When I arrived, I was met by two men in suits who introduced themselves with a simple nod and a handshake. They led me to a small conference room where they laid out exactly what had happened since the panic alert was triggered. Apparently, Karen's upload of photos from the locker had briefly connected to a server linked to ongoing federal operations. While she hadn't intentionally accessed classified material, her actions had triggered an automatic data scrub protocol that nearly disrupted an active program. That alone elevated the issue from local mischief to national security interference. One of the agents slid a file across the table and explained, calmly, that the department had been considering hiring civilian consultants to help with identifying and mitigating local-level risks tied to critical infrastructure. They'd been impressed by how I handled the situation, especially my decision to de-escalate in the moment rather than confront Karen directly. They offered me a consulting role, part-time, remote, focused on civilian education and neighborhood compliance support for federal infrastructure storage zones. In other words, they wanted me to help make sure no more Karens pulled the pin on federal grenades out of pure ignorance. I accepted. Back in the neighborhood, a special election was held to form a new HOA board. This time, instead of campaigning with promises of fines and power plays, candidates talked about transparency, fairness, and letting people actually enjoy their homes. A retired firefighter won the position of president, and one of the first orders of business was eliminating the ridiculous bylaw Karen had abused to target me. I attended the meeting mostly to make sure it all went smoothly, but I didn't speak. I just watched, listened, and smiled as residents voted unanimously to remove the clause about aesthetic authority over external metal structures. As for Karen's trial, it didn't come with cameras or courtroom drama. It was handled behind closed doors, as many federal cases are. But word got around. She had pled guilty to several counts, including misuse of digital infrastructure and trespassing on protected property. She was fined heavily, placed under federal monitoring, and banned from serving on any housing or administrative board for the next 15 years. It was poetic justice, quiet and thorough, just like the mess she'd made. I didn't celebrate. There was nothing joyful about watching someone implode, but I did feel a deep sense of closure. One afternoon a few weeks later, I found a small envelope in my mailbox. No return address. Inside was a handwritten note that read, "You were right. I should have listened. I lost everything." There was no signature, but I knew it was Karen. The writing matched an old welcome note she'd once left in my mailbox years ago when I first moved in, before she ever saw the locker, before the power consumed her. I folded it carefully and placed it in the back of my file binder. Not out of sympathy, but as a reminder. A reminder of how quickly authority can mutate when it's left unchecked. The locker remained. I didn't paint it, hide it, or move it behind a hedge like Karen had always wanted. Instead, I added a new sign. Right below the original federal tag, I screwed in a plaque that read, "Stand here if you've read the Constitution." People laughed when they saw it. Even kids pointed it out and asked questions. It became a sort of neighborhood landmark, the subject of jokes and whispered stories. But it also became a symbol of boundaries, of reason, of what happens when you push too far. Every so often, I still catch neighbors looking over at the spot, as if waiting for another unmarked SUV to roll in or for Karen to make some ridiculous comeback. But nothing like that happens. Instead, there's peace. Real peace. The kind that comes not just from quiet mornings and trimmed hedges, but from the knowledge that the worst is behind you, that justice worked, that the bullies didn't win. I kept up my side of the street, waved to neighbors, joined the weekend barbecues again. The tension had faded, replaced by something lighter, something earned. And though I never wanted to be the guy who turned his neighborhood into a cautionary tale, I understood why people told the story over and over. Because it wasn't just about an ammo locker. It was about what it represented: independence, respect, the refusal to be steamrolled by someone playing tyrant under the banner of policy. In the end, Karen wasn't destroyed by me or even the feds. She was undone by her own arrogance, her own belief that the rules didn't apply to her. And while the neighborhood slowly stitched itself back together, her story remained like a warning etched into the pavement. It reminded us all of something simple yet powerful. There's a difference between leadership and control, between safety and paranoia, between community and dictatorship. Karen never learned that. But we did. And that made all the difference.